Hey everybody, this is Athletes and Antiquities, and in today's video, we're going to be talking about something being the first, and if being the first actually matters in collectibles. So in today's video, we're going to be looking at the firsts of lots of different types of collectibles and kind of drawing comparisons to Pokemon to kind of talk about, like, does the first really matter? Does it matter to us? And does it matter to other collectibles as well, like movies and books and art, all this kind of stuff? Does the first matter? And I'm just gonna get the footnotes out of the way here, get the spark notes for you guys, and I'm gonna basically argue today why yes, in basically every collectible, first reigns supreme, or some type of first. It might not be the first ever of this one type of thing, but the first of the most famous version of it or something. Those always tend to hold the most value. So things like, the coolest is subjective. Prettiest, if this card or if this item, if this piece of jewelry is the prettiest, that is subjective. Best, do you like that car the best? Do you like that movie the best? That is all subjective. But there's one thing that's not subjective, and that's being first. There's only three, in my opinion, there's only three objective measurables in any collectible. Those three are age, rarity, and condition. And I made that list and I thought, hold on, that sounds really similar. That sounds a lot like SM Pratt's mantra, older, rarer, minter, better. And I actually kind of came to basically his exact mantra, like, accidentally. I wasn't thinking about that when I was making this video, but once I was making it, I was like, wow, everything here I'm describing fits that bill of what Scott says of older, rarer, minter, better. So props to him. He was talking about this years ago, but I just want to bring that into Pokemon and kind of talk about why I think that's going to be the thing that will last the most. So so oftentimes the oldest of something are also the rarest, and the older of something is the harder it is to keep it in good condition. So out of those three things, age, rarity, and condition, age affects the other two much more than the other two affect the rest. If you have the age, chances are, not always, but chances are you have the rarity and you have the condition. So so naturally the oldest, they tend to have all that. So therefore, in my opinion, like I've been saying, age is what controls those other two benchmarks, and therefore is the thing we should really look at. So, we know this has been the case historically in Pokemon. The most expensive cards are always, things like the Illustrator, the 97 Pika trophies. The Illustrator was one of the first kind of like trophy sort of like promotions ever given out. The 97 Pikas were the first ever like championship card, given out as a prize. First edition base holos, like you see here with the first edition Zapdos in front of my Apocrypha. The first edition base Zapdos, this was the first like chase card of the first English set, and that's why it holds that premium. So historically, yes, in this hobby, the firsts have reigned supreme. But a lot of people, with a lot of modern cards coming out, people like they see these very hard to pull cards. They think, oh, could those in 20 years be seen as more important than these firsts? And this is all opinionated, so you can disagree with me, and I'd love to hear what you think about it. But I personally think that the firsts will win out, and I'm gonna show you why I think that. I'm not trying to use a crystal ball here. I'm just gonna say, looking at these other collectibles, there seems to be a trend that even with these super popular collectibles, when things get flashier and prettier, the firsts just always have something special about them, and with that, they always carry some value. And I shouldn't say always, in a lot of situations. So, it's normal for fans, before I get into these other examples, I just want to say it's normal for fans of a collectible to collect what's out there in that moment. If I just get into Pokemon, I want to buy those booster boxes, I want to pull those alt arts, I want to build my binders, and that is totally okay. I still have modern cards, I still make binders, but it tends to be that in these other hobbies, as collectors dive deeper into a hobby, they tend to gravitate towards these firsts. So now that I've gotten that out of the way, I'm going to show you guys, I don't know how many examples I have here. I have some little notes on the side, but let's take a look at these other hobbies to see what is the most sought after and therefore what has been the most valuable. So first up, we're kind of very loosely going up in price. It's not always going to be like this, but we're going to kind of go up in prices as we go through these much more established collectibles. So first, let's talk about movie posters. So movie posters, the most expensive poster ever sold for it's like for a movie is a poster for this movie called Metropolis. Metropolis was a silent film from 1927 and is literally one of the first movie posters ever. It's not of the first movie ever, but it's one of the first times that movies were marketed with posters. So in 1927, this is the international version of this poster. This movie was marketed with these movie posters either in theaters or on the sides of stores and stuff like that. And it was very rare. Very few of them have survived. And a good condition copy sold in 2005. So one hasn't sold since 2005. One sold in 2005 for $690,000. So this is the lowest one on the list, $690,000. But it's insane. But it is literally one of the first movie posters ever. So if you love movie posters, people tend to gravitate towards that first, which also happens to be the rarest and had that condition rarity as well. So it's all bundled into one. So that was movie posters. The second thing we're gonna look at is comic books. Now I'll be putting stuff on screen as a reference because I'm not an expert in all these subjects. I'd look up a lot of these in advance and do some research onto why they were valuable. So I'm gonna put these up on screen, but I'm gonna try and explain these the best as I can, but I'm no expert in all of these fields. Comic books is my next one up. Comic books, the most expensive comic book ever sold is Action Comics #1. This is a 1938 comic book, and I'll say it again, 1938, very old, 1938 comic book, and it was the first appearance of Superman. But not only is it the first appearance of Superman, it is also widely considered by comic book collectors as being the first, or like the origin of superhero comics as we know them today. This Action Comics #1 spurred the entire comic book genre, basically. So people go back to that. And like I said, with age, rarity kind of comes naturally with most situations. And this is incredibly rare. And its price backs it up, the highest grade ever for this comic book was a CGC 9. CGC has been grading comic books for a while. They've been doing comic books well before they got into cards, but they were kind of known for doing their comic books. But the CGC 9, highest graded Action Comics 1, was actually first sold by Nicolas Cage in 2011. He had it in his collection, and he sold it for $2.2 million in 2011. But then it was sold again by the collector who bought it from him 10 years later in 2021. During all the mania of other items, it was sold for $3.25 million. And so it honestly didn't increase as much as I thought it would in a 10-year gap as collectibles kind of boomed, as cards boomed, like Pokemon, sports cards, Magic, a lot of like sealed video games, all this stuff went crazy and mooned. But since comic books was so established, it wasn't like there was some flood into comic books because there was already that passion, there was already that money there. So it only really increased $1 million, which sounds funny, only increased $1 million, but compared to some other things that have increased so exponentially since then, it honestly was more stable than I thought it'd be. So yeah, $3.25 million in 2021. But another interesting fact is I was looking up a list, and out of the top 10 most expensive comic books ever sold, not a single one is more recent than 1945. And this plays into this age. Obviously, you could look at it and be like, oh, obviously Action Comics 1 is the most expensive because it's pretty much the first comic book ever, or the first prominent comic book ever featuring superheroes. But even the other top 10, They're all 1945 and earlier, and they all happen to be first appearances of a character because people care about that. You know, sometimes it's first edition, but sometimes this isn't a first edition. Sometimes it's just a first appearance of of a character, and first appearance of an Espeon, first appearance of this of like trading cards. This is an 1888 card, one of the first trading card sets ever. One of the first boxing cards that was like in a set. You know, up here I'm gonna move my display here. Sorry if it's shaky. I have a Civil War newspaper, a 1906 music sheet. This stuff, this is not necessarily the first because I can't afford the firsts of all this stuff, but I try and get as close to that as I can. And it seems that in these other hobbies, they value it the same way. You know, the top 10 comic books were all earlier than 1945, and they were all first edition. There have been flashier comic books. There have been possibly more exciting comic books, but nothing, that's not a word. Nothing has beat the firsts. So that was comic books. Now we're going on to baseball cards. Probably the biggest like one-to-one of Pokemon, the most similar hobby. And if you're aware of it, it was fairly recently, so it was everywhere in all like trading card media. Even Pokemon people were covering it, but it was the 1952 Topps Mickey Mantle SGC 9.5, which has been called the finest known example. And I don't personally like the finest known example designation. SGC gave it that because the guy that graded it was literally told SGC, he was like, I've seen 1,000 of these, this is the best one I've ever seen. And they were like, yeah, sure, bro. And they just put finest known example on that card, which I think is really weird, and gave it like a prominence that maybe it wouldn't have had otherwise. It was still a 9.5. It's still a beautiful card of a very rare release. But I don't like the fact that they called it the finest known example, because there are PSA 10s, and yes, I know SGC is sometimes more strict, so an SGC 9.5 could be a PSA 10, but like, I don't know, there's a few 9.5s. I think Rosen, the collector, I forget his first name, something Rosen has a PSA 10 that looks just as good. But regardless, highest known sale, $12.6 million in 2022. $12.6 million for the SGC 9.5. I think it was sold at the National, right? Or was it leading up to the National or something? It was right around that time. And now obviously you're thinking of firsts, because this whole video is about firsts. This is not the first baseball card ever, but I still consider it a first because it is the rookie card of probably the most famous baseball player ever. And it's also like the most famous baseball card. You know, there is the T206. The T206 is a runner-up. The T206 Honus Wagner was a very rare card that was recalled because Honus Wagner didn't want his card to be sold in cigarette packs because like it would like almost be marketing cigarettes towards children. So in 1910, when T206 came out, it was they were all pulled from the packs, but a couple got out, and an SGC2 of that sold in 2022 for $7.25. So it's kind of on the heels of the Mickey Mantle, but the Mickey Mantle is still supreme. And neither of those are technically firsts, but they're each the first of something very important in that hobby, which I think is just as crucial to make a note of. So that was baseball cards. Now we're on to stamps. After this point, we start getting into stuff that I do not know anything about. Like I love movies. I love baseball cards. I love like the other categories I've said, like comic books. I love that stuff, so I had some knowledge of that ahead of time, but all this stuff going forward, I have very little knowledge on. This was all research, so if I say something incorrect, let me know. I did a decent amount, so I'm very confident with this list, but if you have something to add, if you're very interested and very knowledgeable in one of these subjects, let me know. But the next thing we're going to talk about is stamps. So the most expensive stamp ever is, I'm just going to read it off my sheet here, is the ball cover with Moridius 1D red with a XX designation. That's a mouthful. I can't explain what any of that means. I apologize. There's probably better videos of it on YouTube that just talk about that one item in particular, but I will preface it with that. But with the research I did, I excluded sheets of stamps. There are sheets of stamps that have sold for more, but I feel like that doesn't really count because, I don't know, a single stamp, this was the most expensive stamp ever sold at $11.2 million. So almost the same price as the 52 Mickey Mantle. But the reason why this is so valuable, which is the key here, it is one of the earliest stamps in existence. And according to the Smithsonian Magazine, so I trust them on this, the Smithsonian Magazine said this like kind of wave of stamps that was released represents the dawn of social communication, because it was one of the first stamps ever. It was the first time people were sending mail to each other. So the Smithsonian calls it the dawn of social communication, which is a very valid title to give it. This stamp is from the mid 1800s. Yeah, so that's basically it for this stamp. It's another example of a first being king. So yeah, 11.2 million for stamp. But I don't have much to add to it because I'm not very knowledgeable about that. But the next item is, we're taking a big step up here in prices. Now we're on to historical documents, which is kind of a broad term, but there is one very widely agreed upon historical document that is considered the most expensive, which is, get this, we're getting into the big stuff here. This is beyond fictional creatures, athletes. This is big stuff here. This is the most expensive historical document ever sold. Was a first edition print of the US Constitution, and it sold for $43.2 million in 2021. And why I love this one is it is a prime example of the value of firsts. Now, obviously this isn't like the first historical document ever. Like that's a meaningless statement. What does that even mean? What is a historical document? Is it like the Rosetta Stone? I don't know. But like this is a first. It's not the first historical document. I don't even know if you can pinpoint that, but it is a first historical document. It is not the Constitution. That would be a whole different thing. If that ever sold publicly, we'd have much bigger problems. There'd probably be a problem in America. But a first edition print, so that when the Constitution was written, they printed these and gave them out to people so they could read. And one of these has, a few of them, but one of the ones that survived these hundreds of years sold for $43.2 million. And it's the first document of a major category of collectibles. And that major category is literally US history. It is one of the first documents ever in US history. And many US history collectors want it, and this is the holy grail of that genre. So it makes sense that it's the first one. There's been historical documents since then, but the first reigns supreme. So now we're going into books. Books, again, it's kind of hard to find because a lot of books are like kind of sold to museums. Everything going forward, a lot of things are sold to museums, and it's not like collector to collector. The Constitution document, that was to a collector. It was like a public sale. But everything after this, the numbers are a little weird because it was like, oh, it was donated to a museum and appraised at this much, or it was bought by a collector then immediately donated to a museum. So it's like, you don't know if like it was like a crowd fund. It gets weird after this because this is like very high-end stuff, but you'll see what I mean. So the next item is book. Well, what is the most expensive book ever sold? It's the Codex, I'm gonna say the word wrong, it's the Leicester, the Codex Leicester by Leonardo da Vinci in 1510. This book was sold in 1994 for an inflation-adjusted $54.4 million to Bill Gates. So I say inflation-adjusted because this is the first item that sold a very long time ago. It was, almost 30 years ago. So the price that it sold for at the time might not mean as much, but it's $54.4 million in today's money. So why is this Codex special? Aside from not obviously being Leonardo da Vinci's, it's not just a book of Leonardo da Vinci. This was his science diary. He wrote all of his science experiments, his science thoughts. His science mind was poured into this book, which is something incredible. I can't even fathom that. It's just, it's a piece of not just like a collectible, not just, a country's history. This is like a piece of world history. It's a piece of this is important to the entire human race, which is, I know it's hard to really kind of put into words. I'm not very eloquent about it, but $54.4 million is a lot of money, But for something like that, it's hard for me to even put a price on it. Obviously that is the price, because that's what it sold for, but it's hard for me to attach a monetary value to something of such importance. Like, this book sold for more than the literal Magna Carta. And if you know anything about history, that you know what that means. That's a crazy statement. So again, this is a talk about firsts, and like, this isn't the first book ever, but it's like the book of one of the most prominent people ever. So I still consider it a first because it has that age, it has that rarity, and I guess it has that condition as well. Sorry about that pause here. So that was the book. The next item we're going to talk about is jewelry. And for the jewelry, again, we're getting into stuff that the sales are kind of weird, but it has such a rich history. Like, you've read about it in textbooks. And this is the Hope Diamond. The Hope Diamond is the most expensive piece of jewelry ever purchased, which was, get a big jump here, $250 million, $250 million for the Hope Diamond. And I'll tell you a brief story about it if you're not familiar. It's a very famous diamond that came from an Indian diamond mine in 1666 and was purchased by a jeweler from France named Jean-Baptiste Tavernier. He's fairly famous if you've read European history. Jean-Baptiste bought this, he purchased it from the Indian mine in around 1666, and it was then sold 2 years later to King Louis XIV in 1668. And it remained in the royal family for about 100 years. And then in 1792, it was actually stolen from the royal family. And this is where the history of this diamond becomes so famous, because once it was stolen, it kind of bounced between people's hands. People bought it from each other, people stole it from each other, but every single person that came in possession of this Hope Diamond died very suddenly and very tragically, which led everyone to believe that it was a cursed item. It was believed to be a cursed piece of jewelry, which is what gave it this fame and notoriety. So yeah, various people owned it ever since it was stolen in 1792, and it kind of bounced between people, but it was eventually purchased by someone named Harry Winston in 1949 for $250 million in today's money. But I want to make that clear. It was not $250 million in that year's money. It was a lower price, but in inflation adjusted prices, it was $250 million in today's money. And then he then donated it to the Smithsonian, which is where it resides now. So again, you're probably thinking I'm derailing a bit from these firsts, but like, I'm doing my best to try and show you like older historical storied items will outpace. There's nothing that can be made now that could compete with the Hope Diamond. There's too much going for it. And I think the previous examples were better in terms of like, rookie cards and first movie posters, stuff like that. But I think this still does provide some value onto what do other hobbies value. And we're gonna get into our last item for today, which is art. And art gets insane because art, there's a lot of money laundering in art. It's very subjective. A lot of prices are not really prices. They're more just like appraisals and then donations, because the whole art scene is very confusing. Like, it was very hard for me to weed through like actual purchases, because someone would be like, oh, this painting was I'll search up what is the most expensive painting of all time, and it'd be like, oh, this painting was appraised at this much and then it was donated to a museum. And it's like, okay, that's not real. Like, that's just some person said it was worth that much. What did one actually sell for? And what I came to was another Da Vinci. He's made it twice on this list. Very, very good Leonardo da Vinci. The most expensive painting ever publicly sold was the Salvator Mundi by Da Vinci for a whopping, ready, $542 million. That is over $500 million. It was purchased by a group of people that kind of pooled their money. It was not a single person, but it was still a public sale for $542 million. And art, like I said, it's very difficult to fit into our video because art, it's all one of a kind. It's not like, oh, what was the first print? I mean, I guess they have prints afterwards, but like most art that anyone's buying for value is all one of a kind. there's no comps, you know, because it was just someone had it for 100 years and someone else bought it. It's very difficult to track these kind of things, but like this is a public auction, so I think it's a good metric. And this Da Vinci painting, it was painted in 1500, and it's not a first. It was not his first painting ever. His first painting ever was the Baptism of Christ in 1475, so 25 years earlier, a pretty significant time gap for someone's lifespan. But Baptism of Christ is located in the Uffizi Gallery in Florence, Italy, where it has been for years. And it's probably never going to be sold publicly due to the prestige of having that piece of art in that gallery. So to be like, oh, well, it's not the first painting. Like, what are we even talking about anymore? Like, it's not Leonardo's first painting, but it's one of his few public sales of the most prominent artist of all time, Leonardo da Vinci. You know, he painted the Mona Lisa. The Mona Lisa would probably sell for more as well, but like that's never going to get publicly sell. The Louvre, is that how you say it? The Louvre? The Louvre is not going to be like, all right, we're putting the Mona Lisa on eBay, you know? Like, it's hard to have these one-to-one comparisons. But, so yeah, the Salvator Mundi, one of the few Da Vinci paintings to ever be sold at a public auction, so I'm still counting it as a first. But that was my list of different hobbies, you know, different collectibles, environments, and kind of what each hobby has valued the most. And obviously, it's hard to compare a Leonardo da Vinci painting to a first edition Zapdos, or an old boxing card, or an old newspaper. It's hard to really draw a comparison there. But the importance is, I think, in basically every example, people value age, they value history, they value firsts. Even if it's not the first, they value a first of something significant. So why am I making this video? Am I saying that all modern stuff is bad? No, I love modern, I collect modern, but let's say doomsday, the Pokemon hobby starts to go down in popularity. As it goes down in popularity, as we've seen in other collectibles, even if something goes down in popularity, the originals are some of the few things that hold value. You know, Hot Wheels used to be very valuable, but the most valuable Hot Wheels, while the rest of the market has come down tremendously, those most valuable ones stay high because those few people that are still in the hobby, they want the best. Same thing with other hobbies. Like, this is gonna be a joke. Like, even Beanie Babies, there's actually still valuable Beanie Babies, even though the 99.99% of Beanie Babies are like basically worthless now. Those few that were legitimately rare, that kind of spurred this whole craze, there is still value. They still sell for thousands of dollars. And like we said in these other examples, movie posters, trading cards, comic books, regular books, all this stuff, people value the rarity, they value the history, they value the age. So like, what do you think about that? Do you think that would translate to Pokemon? You know, like, do you think these rarest, these oldest items, these first edition base, these old trophy cards, will they remain head and shoulders above the rest? Or do you think that Pokemon will introduce serialized cards and rarer alt arts that will kind of skew that towards modern? I'd love to hear what you think about that, where you stand on that. Let me know in the comments. Thanks.